Good morning, everyone. The reading this morning is Exodus 16, the manna and quail. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You're not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked towards the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, "No one is to keep any of it till morning." However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Each morning everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days are you to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any." Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath, That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." So Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations to come." As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law so that it might be preserved. The Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning, St. John's Egham. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jörg and I'm an occasional preacher here. So this morning I have the delightful task of unpacking the story of manna with you, the story that we just heard about. So what is going to be our takeaway? Well, here's one candidate. 10 omer equals 1 ephah. Did you know that? I didn't. And next time Carlos has this in one of his quizzes, you'll thank me I included it in this slide. But perhaps more seriously, we could ask, what was manna? Maybe that will help us understand the story. What is it? In fact, the Bible packs a little etymology joke, a little language joke into the story here. Because if you were to say, what is it in Hebrew, you would say something like manhua, manha, manna. For 40 years in the desert, people ate, what is it? In other Semitic languages, manna actually means honeydew or aphid, like you see in my slide here. That led some scholars to believe that perhaps it was a natural occurrence, that aphids sucked enough honeydew out of plants, which would then crystallize at night. It falls down, where you can pick it up in the morning, and of course you want to do that early enough before the ants get it or the sunlight melts it. There's only one small problem with that theory. If you're in the desert, where are you going to find enough plants with enough aphids to produce honeydew for several hundreds of people? Similarly, other scholars suggest that the tamarisk tree, which apparently was widespread in the Sinai desert, is the real natural phenomenon behind manna. The tamarisk tree, and there even is a variant that's called tamarisk manna, produces a sort of resin that you can pick off. It's sweet, it's edible, and interestingly enough, sunlight melts it, so it would disappear during the day. But again, same problem applies. If you have enough resin to feed several hundred people, you're probably not camping in the desert, but in a veritable manna, in a tamarisk forest. Finally, some scholars have suggested that it was some sort of a lichen, as you see down here, some of which grows in the desert, and some of which are edible, sweet tasting, and you can pound it into some sort of flour to bake a cake or piece of bread with. Well, I'm not so sure. We don't really know what it was. Maybe it was a supernatural occurrence after all, but does that really take us further in our understanding of the story? Maybe we should ask instead what the story means for us today. Well, the obvious, most straightforward reading is, it's a story about God providing a solution in times of need. So let's try that. We are all sitting in the desert, and it is 2020. We have a global pandemic going on. It's a time of hardship, and now we need to figure out what God's solution might look like. But then I wonder, are we really in the desert together? Are we all in the same desert? Compared globally, there's some countries who could not throw a fraction of the money at the problem as we were able to do in England. But even here, disparities are quite widespread. Some of us were very anxious from the beginning, maybe even knew somebody who had been ill or got ill themselves, or perhaps even lost their loved ones. Others from us only know the disease from our news. Some of us have been working as normal as before, only from home and getting used to tons and tons of Zoom meetings. And others of us have been furloughed with nothing to do, waiting for this to pass. Some of us think they're going to be okay. Paychecks will keep coming. Pensions will keep coming. Others face an uncertain future, like students finishing up university now, or people faced with the prospect of losing their jobs. Are we really all in the same crisis? And then what kind of solution are we looking for? Is our solution answer that perhaps manna was a natural occurrence? So then the sermon would sound something like this. Isn't it great how in God's good world you can find solutions emerging in places when you didn't think there were any? Don't give yourself up. Keep looking. Something will turn up. God has created a good world around you. Or should we say something like, perhaps a bit more of a supernatural take, stay and pray. Manna will fall from heaven. God will meet your needs. He will send somebody who will help you. Hang in there. Manna from heaven will come. I'm not so sure that any of these really work. And then there's another strand in the story that's quite bothersome. There's a funny tension that runs through the story. And perhaps if you look at the woman in this picture, she embodies this tension in her face. The people have been grumbling. God seems slightly upset. The grumbling wasn't right. And then God gives all these rules. And the story tells us that people disobeyed these rules, that they gathered more than they should. Perhaps that's why this woman looks so distraught. In a different telling of the story in Numbers 11, it is even worse. God gets very upset with people grumbling about his provisions, and he kills some of them. And then he has passion, and he sends quail and manna. And as people are eating the quail, as they have them still, the meat stuck in their teeth, God gets angry at them again, and some get stomach pains, really severe cramps. It's almost as if God doesn't want to provide. So there's this weird tension running through the story. So I'm not so sure we can unpack this story in such a straight way. So what I'd like to do is to take you on a journey with me and see what we can find. So I think to really understand our story, we need to change our perspective. And this is why I'm now out here in my garden, inside a little willow house that we planted when our children were still small enough to enjoy such a thing. Now it gets less use, but we still love to see how it fills in every year, and it's a lovely shady spot. But why am I really out here? Well, you see, the people of Israel to this day celebrate the festival of Sukkot every year, which we know in English as the Feast of Tabernacles. It is primarily a celebration of harvest, but one of the special parts of this feast is that for 7 days people live in temporary dwelling structures, little booths or tabernacles, tents perhaps. And I think this is an amazing idea because it links the plentiful of God's harvest with remembering the precariousness of human life. The tabernacles are a memory how God brought people out of Egypt, how he sustained them in the wilderness. Taken out of the comfort of their own home, the people of Israel remember a time of crisis right at the time of harvest. Isn't that amazing? Maybe I should try this with my family sometime, roughing it in nature and relive the precariousness of human life. But here's my real point. We need to read the story of Exodus not just as a story about the original event, but for what it really is, a part of the collective memory book of Israel. It would have been told from generation to generation, especially in tabernacles like this. Children would learn about how God got Israel through. And later, in exile, at another time of national crisis, these stories were committed to paper in their final edited form. But importantly, they're not just stories of national triumph, but they're very frank about human nature. Remembering failure seems to be important to Israel when crisis strikes. Why is that? Well, let me read you another verse about manna. This one comes right out of the collective memory book of Israel, in the book of Deuteronomy. And here we have in chapter 8 a whole list about how not to forget the Lord. And from verse 16 it says this: He gave you manna to eat in the desert, something your fathers had never known, to humble and to test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power, my strength, the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for he is the one who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your forefathers, as it is today. Wow. Being humble isn't about making ourselves feel bad. It is about being realistic about our own abilities. And at a time of national crisis, it seems like it is more important than ever before. Because if we just tell stories about triumph of ourselves, the harder it will be when crisis hits, through illness perhaps, circumstances out of our control, or a global pandemic like the one we're living through. In situations like this, the inability to be humble, to say sorry, becomes a serious liability because you cannot learn. It makes you look foolish, detached from reality. Think of how various politicians reacted to this crisis. The ones who blustered, the ones who pointed fingers at others and refused to say sorry were exposed for the fools they are. And the ones who learned, the ones who apologized, became stronger all the more. So what about us? What about you and I? Which of our failures should we learn and recognize and keep in mind so we can get through hard times? The story gives us some clues, some places to look at. Firstly, I'm struck by how quickly the mood shifts in Israel. Just 15 days before we hear they were brought through the Red Sea. They were delivered from slavery out of Egypt. God brought them through waters. And yet, 15 days later, they're sitting in front of empty food pots and saying, if only none of this had happened. Is that you sometimes? Is that me sometimes? That our memory culture is askew? It is tainted by the crisis of today? Our mood turns really quickly. We forget. Maybe this is something we should learn about. The second thing that really strikes me is the intensity, the sheer anger, the despair that comes through the story. Oh, that the Lord would have killed us in Egypt. Despair and anger are two normal reactions when we feel trapped. Martin Luther King III, the son of the famous civil rights leader, recently commented on the Minneapolis protests by quoting his father, saying, "A riot is the language of the unheard." And he has a point, of course. This is not to condone violence and rioting, but to understand where it comes from and what must change. How about you in a time of crisis? How about you when anger and what is boxing you in when anger and despair flares up? Do you feel unheard by God, by other people? Do you think somebody should hear your cause? Is it perhaps something you should rally others behind? What is it that drives you to anger? What can you do about it? Direct that energy toward what seems to box you in. And there's another weakness that the story mentions, a weakness about disobedience. No, not about the rule about staying home on the seventh day, we'll get to that later on, but the one about collecting no more than you need. There's something greedy in human nature. We get something for free and we still want to hoard it, we want to amass it. The biblical story reminds us that there is a human drive to exploit that we need to keep in check. What an important message for the ecological crisis of our day. We haven't paid heed to this for so many years. We've taken and taken from nature until it got spoiled. And this comes from a sense of entitlement. It's ours. And it comes from a disobedience. Hey, a little more won't hurt. I know I should be more sustainable, but really, I don't really make a difference. And yet, the manna gets spoiled. It's high time we learn to live again within our means, to enjoy and not exploit the free gift of God's creation. These are just some aspects of what Israel's remembrance of the story of manna entails. The point is that even in a time of crisis, it is good to remember our failures. This is an act of hope because it says we're not boxed in. We can realize our mistakes, we can change. So perhaps we should sit in a humble dwelling and reflect on our limits because it helps us grow. What have we taken for granted? What can we learn now? What of our crisis mechanisms should we think about honestly? How do we react What makes us angry? What boxes us in? Let's remember our failures so we can grow. As you can see, I've now moved on in my journey, and I'm now probably in my most favorite place within a 5-mile radius of St. John's Egham. This is the Valley Gardens in Windsor Great Park. I just love to come up here and enjoy the beauty of nature. In these weeks of lockdown, I've enjoyed coming up here in the evenings on my bike, just right around the park, enjoy the cool of the evening, and see the occasional animal. It is a great place to unwind, to take a rest, and that connects with another aspect of our manna story I want to unpack with you, and that is the command of the Sabbath rest. At first glance, this whole thing seems totally petty. People are already only scraping by, and now they have to observe all these rules. On 5 days, you can only collect as much as you can eat, but on the 6th day, you must collect for 2 days. Not only won't it spoil this time, but there also won't be anything to collect on the 7th day. You must keep the Sabbath. Really, God? Aren't people busy enough to be spared such rules? Surely collecting a bit of manna in the morning isn't going to spoil their Sabbath rest. But there is an important insight in this story for a theme of hope in times of crisis. It is important to take breaks from the daily toil. Not just because our body needs rest, as so many studies show, but because of what we just talked about. It is important to acknowledge our limits. No matter how big your worry is, there's only so much you can do about it. And once you've done that, you have to take the effort, you have to obey, to step away and take time out, to chase away the worries, to leave it in God's hands for that one day. You will return to it, sure enough, again tomorrow. But for now, it's time to acknowledge that your efforts have limits, that you are not fully in charge, that you must take time out so the problem doesn't swallow you up, that the problem doesn't box you in. So the need for rest is an important aspect of our story, but there's more. Aaron is instructed to collect some manna and keep it in a pot. How much manna, you ask? Well, 1 omer, which is 1/10 of an ephah. All right, it's about 9 cups in real measures. The book of Hebrew later tells us that this was placed inside the Ark of the Covenant, alongside the tablets with the 10 Commandments, which condensed God's law, of course, and Aaron's rod, which symbolized divine power. The Ark of the Covenant was, of course, the most sacred item of Jewish worship. It was the place of God's presence in their midst. So this is what you commemorate in times of rest. The tablet, Aaron's staff, and the pot of manna. It seems to me that as Christians we tend to focus on the first 2, but forget the pot of manna. Because we do talk about the importance of reading the Bible. It aligns us with God's will, just as the stone tablets did. And we also talk about prayer, our search for God's presence and His wonder-working power in our lives and those around us, symbolized by Aaron's staff. But how often do we take out the pot of manna? How often do we stop to count our blessings? Do we spend enough time to look for things in our lives to be thankful for? This is a very important part of Sabbath rest. And whether it is just making a list or going through an old photo album or telling someone how great it is they are in your life, it's time to count your manna. And you know what? Since we still don't know what manna was, something that fell straight from heaven or a natural phenomenon in the desert, you can count either. That special experience with God or all those normal, natural things in your life that you can be thankful for. Sherry recently told me an interesting story about the time when her family was going through a severe economic crisis, which in the end involved them losing their house and all their savings. The memory that she most vividly has of that time is how a friend from church took them to a wholesale market and bought a whole room full of pantry items, enough to see them through their basic needs for several months. At that point, Sherry was already an adult. She was in college. She shared the worry of her parents. But when she told the story, she opened a pot of manna, even in commemorating this crisis. So come on now, open that pot of manna this morning. Count your omer of blessings. Share it with your friends and family. Build a culture of thankfulness, because in the middle of crisis, there are reasons to be thankful. No matter what faces you tomorrow, there are still tokens of God's goodness to rediscover today. Tokens that give us strength to face tomorrow. The final stop on our journey inevitably leads back to St. John's, where I'm now. Why is that? Well, because Jesus also remembered the manna story. Well, he didn't only remember it, he reenacted it and transformed it. He reenacted it by feeding the multitudes when out in the wilderness. And this time, the manna didn't just fall from heaven, it was something that the disciples offered. God blessed it and multiplied it. And immediately after Jesus did this miracle, he retreated and the crowd found him again. And then we have this really interesting exchange developing in John 6, from which I want to read a few verses now. Jesus said to them, "I tell you the truth, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." Skipping a few verses. I am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate the manna in the desert, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Wow, there's so much to unpack in these passages, and John 6 could easily be a whole sermon series by itself. I want to focus instead on what Jesus does with the manna tradition here, and that is this. Instead of promising some drip, drip, drip provision to prevent death in times of crisis, he embodies the manna to abolish death altogether. So instead of being put on heavenly life support, we are now to expect the life of heaven to fill us as we take hold of the manna that Jesus is. And sisters and brothers, let's not reduce this idea to a theoretical religious truth. This is not about telling people about Jesus, getting them to heaven, or it's not just about telling people about Jesus, getting them to pray the prayer of salvation and then waiting with holy smiles on our faces until we get to heaven. In the past year, I've preached twice about heaven, and both times the message that really stuck out to me was how the hope of heaven takes hold of our life here on earth. It is about the life that bursts forth from Jesus, the light that shines from his resurrection, that orientates us in our day-to-day lives, that fills us even now. You see, this is why Jesus claims that those who partake in his life will not see death. He's not denying the reality of bodily death, but he has abolished the hold that it has on our life. So I'm sitting here in front of St. John's, right in the middle of the cemetery. There's no denying of the physicality of death. Many, many Christians have died in peace and in war, from illness and from natural causes, and yes, many even in pandemics. But this was not the story of their lives. They preached the good news of Jesus Christ against greed, selfishness, and sin. They sought to let him shine through their actions. They turned to Jesus in times of peace and times of trouble. And as a result, the gospel, the good news of the kingdom of God coming down to earth, has prevailed. Just like the disciples in the story of the feeding of the multitudes, they brought what they had, and look at us, we're still feeding on it now. Last Sunday, Esther challenged us with a question from Ezekiel 37. Can these dry bones live? She asked. And today I say to you, this is also the question as we commemorate manna. Can these dry bones live? Can we look for more than the drip, drip feed from God in our daily lives, our needs and worries? But can we embrace his spirit, plug into this new life from God, ingest the fullness of manna that Jesus embodied? Will we embody this life in our families, toward our neighbors, in our communities, as a life that bursts forth from church into Egham, even as our doors are closed? So, here we are, back where we started. And we've learned that there was actually a lot to discover in how Israel commemorated the story of manna. And here's my question to you. What is your main takeaway? Is it perhaps time for the humble hut to reevaluate your crisis-solving strategies? To think about what holds you back, what boxes you in, and why? To acknowledge that not everything is under your control? To be humble before your God? Or is it time to just take a real good Sabbath break today? To step away from it all, to enjoy nature, to find peace, to break out the manna pot and count out the blessings that God has showered upon your life? Or is it to reconnect with the story of the eternal manna, with Jesus, the living bread, with the kingdom come, that story that orients our future and our lives in the present, that changes how we behave toward neighbor and others? What is it? What is your takeaway? As we now go into our agape meal, I invite you to reflect on this a bit. Maybe even stop the video for a moment. Talk to those around you, or think about it yourself. What the story means for you today. Discover new aspects. This is such a central aspect of our faith, because as we pray in the Lord's Prayer, our daily bread give us today. What does that mean for you in your circumstances? Amen.